Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. My name is Heather, and on this channel I like to walk a very fine line between a shopping addicted makeup monster and a responsible adult with a makeup hobby. Now, I really enjoy eyeshadow singles, duochromes, multichromes, blush, highlight, lip gloss, basically everything except pressed glitter, and today we're going to be doing a ranking of a bunch of grungy, swampy palettes. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, stick with me, we're getting into it right now. Alright, so I believe I have 30 palettes here, and for the most part, the vibe is like murky, swampy, greens, blues, purples, some neutrals, all kinds of fun, delicious things. This eye look, by the way, is coming from the Moon Shroom palette by Lunar Beauty, so if you're interested in that look, it should already be up on my channel or coming up very soon. Coming in at number 30 is the Nomad Berlin Underground palette, and this palette it was one of the first palettes I picked up from Nomad Cosmetics, and it definitely has that like murky, swampy quality to it, but most of the shades that are in here are a satin, and for me that is just not like my ideal finish for shadows. That's either too soft to be a matte or not exciting enough to be a metallic or duochrome or anything like that. So this palette doesn't get a ton of love from me, but I'm a collector of Nomad, so I have a hard time getting rid of their palettes. So I still have it, but that's why it's coming in at number 30. Coming in at 29 is another Nomad palette. This is the Haunted Europe palette, and this one I put down a little bit lower because there's really only like half the palette that I like, and it's kind of this part here in the center. The oranges and browns, these sort of orangey red shades, I'm not super excited about. So for me, there's definitely some shades that are kind of throwaway for me in this palette, which is why I ranked it lower. I've used it a couple times, but I just don't have, like, as much as it inspired me when I first saw it online, when I actually have it in person, I get kind of lost with this palette, and then I don't really know what to do with it, and then I end up going to use something else. So I put it down lower for that reason. Coming in at 28 is the Sugar Pill. This was their Halloween launch. I believe this is volume 4. Does it say on here anywhere? No, this might be 3 actually, because I think 4 is the golden capsule, but this is the sort of grungy, swampy one. I like the mattes that they have in this particular palette, and I really like this kind of murky blue shade that they included. The bright pink is a little bright and poppy for everything else that's in here, but in general I think it's a nice color story, and so that plus the packaging means it gets to stick around, but it's not my absolute favorite formula, so it definitely is towards the bottom. I have, this is the Unicorn Gang Shop palette, and it looks like this. It's definitely like colorful, swampy, murky kind of shades. Again, I've said this before, I really like the mattes that are in here. The metallics that are in here are kind of like softly pigmented, so they're not super sparkly or dynamic or interesting, and because of that it kind of falls a little bit lower. In general, the color story is really great though, and I think the packaging is pretty too. Next up is Melt Gemini, and this is the original Gemini palette, I think in the the newer packaging, but this is the original Gemini, and I like this color story a lot, particularly for the greens. These sort of swampy orangey neutrals I don't get as much use out of, but I think in general the color story is pretty. I like that you have a nice gradient for both sort of halves of the palette, if you will, and I think the packaging is pretty too. Then I put this one in, but this one is sort of like a tougher sell. This is the Beauty Bay Dark Fantasy palette, and it looks like this. Now, I definitely think this has grungy qualities to it because it has these sort of like deeper shades here, and some of the shades over here, but there's also a lot of like brighter shades here in the center that I'm not sure really fall into that grunge category, but I thought I would go ahead and mention it anyway. I love the Beauty Bay formula, but this is one of the palettes out of their collection that I tend not to gravitate to as much, just because I feel it's very disjointed and I struggle to make looks cohesively out of just this palette. Next up is the Unearthly Dead of Night palette, and I got this one after their sort of like rebrand, relaunch kind of thing, and I think it's pretty. It's definitely like grungy, deep, kind of dark tones, which I really appreciate, and I like this metallic shade here. The blue down here is nice as well, but overall the color story just, I feel like something is missing, and I can't quite decide what it is, but there's something that is missing out of this color story that makes it hard to make looks out of this color story by itself, so that's why it falls a little lower. And then this palette I feel like I haven't talked about in ages. I don't even know if this brand still exists, but this is the Exotic Peacock palette from Pinky Rose Cosmetics, and you can see it has kind of the swampy green, blue, purple vibe, which is definitely something I really enjoy and appreciate. The metallics in this particular palette are very like soft, kind of typical metallics that you would expect. These palettes are very old. So, you know, I don't expect them to be like over the top wowing me at this point, but I think that's part of why they rank a little bit lower, because now there are just like newer, more exciting things on the market. Next up is Klarity Cobra, and this is from their original launch before they started changing around their packaging, and I do like this one a lot. It's very like swampy, grungy, murky, which I think is a beautiful collection of colors here. The metallics in here are nice too, although their formula tends to be a little bit drier, so definitely use a glitter glue with those. And I think for me personally, I end up having to use another palette to sort of give me the lighter shades to blend everything out, because these are otherwise super, super deep and dark, and I can use this in my outer corner, but I can't bring this up to my brows, you know what I mean? So I need something to kind of balance that out, but overall I think this is a really pretty palette too. Then we have the Hocus Pocus, the original Gather Round Sisters from Colourpop, and it looks like this. Definitely have kind of that grungy undertone to it, especially with the greens and the sort of purpley mauve shades that are in here. Obviously the neutrals don't really excite me too much one way or another. I do like the sparkly black shade that's in here though. Overall, I think I love this palette more so for the packaging than I do for the color story inside, which is why it fell a little bit lower. And that kind of wraps up the bottom end of like the I like them, they're fine kind of category. Now getting into more like, I'm more excited about these palettes, but they're not my absolute favorites. Sort of the yellow light, if you will. And I have Nars. This is their Climax palette. And this is one of the more neutral palettes that I have in the video to talk about today. And again, I think it just has this like soft kind of grungy quality to it. I really like the blue and the green metallic shades that are in here. I think this light champagne makes a really nice inner corner. I like that you have kind of these different shades to blend out your crease with, but you really only have one like deep dark shade. If you use this shade and this shade together, the depth, you're gonna kind of lose the green once you start blending it out into this sort of like mauve plum purpley brown shade. So that's kind of a drawback for me, but in general I think this is a really pretty color story too. And I do really like the quality on that one. Alright, next up is the Sirens palette, and this is coming from Jolie Beauty, and it is enormous. But it looks like this. Definitely like swampy grungy shades for sure, and then you've got some sort of pops of purple that are not necessarily so swampy, but like that is swamp for sure. The drawback for this one and why it ranks lower is because all these really beautiful shades that you're seeing here are pressed glitters, and I'm not a huge fan of pressed glitters. I really wish they hadn't have done that. But the multi-chrome shades in here, which are these two, are very, very pretty. I think they are comparable to like a Cliona or Divina, Cosmetics, something like that. They're like super buttery and pigmented there, you can see. Oof. So, so pretty. So those two shades definitely save this palette, which is why it ranks up a little higher, but can't go any higher than this because there's so many freaking pressed glitters. Ugh! And then there's the two multi-chrome shades in case you wanted to see. They're definitely not as pigment heavy as like a Cliona or Divina, but they have that really high shine quality, which I appreciate. Then I have NYX Ultimate Utopia, and I debated about putting this one in or not because it is like super neutral, but I did decide to go ahead and throw it in here because I think it does have a lot of like cooler toned kind of swampier shades here, and then you have kind of these murky mustardy browns and clay colors that I think also kind of add to that aesthetic, if you will. I think this is a really pretty palette. This is one that I got from my husband ages ago, and I just keep coming back to it even though I'm not a big like giant palette user. This is one that definitely has stood the test of time because the quality is so good. Right, now we're getting into stuff that like I really like. So let's keep going here. Next up is the Lunar Beauty Siren Sunset palette, and it looks like this. Again, you have some multi-chromes in here, this one and this one, I believe. The palette itself is very pretty but very neutral, so it kind of just barely creeps onto this sort of grungy criteria that I had for this ranking. I do really like that you have a lot of different deep tones to pick from, which I think is quite nice. The downside though, you only have one colorful like mid-tone matte. Everything else is really light or really neutral, so it's hard to kind of build out those colorful eye looks, but in general I think this is a really pretty formula and I really, really like that shade. Next up is the Dark Matter palette from Kraken Cosmetics, and this is the only palette I have from them, but definitely very grungy. I like that the pans are magnetic so you can pop them in and out, and you actually do have to pop them in the first place to assemble it when you first get it. That's kind of a minus, but they do leave you a key here so you know what to put where. Anyway, I think the mattes in here are really soft, buttery, kind of like silky mattes, and the metallics I think have sort of that buttery, silky quality too, but that tends to mean that they're not as pigmented and dimensional when it comes to going on the lid. I feel like it looks really pretty when I first put it on, but by the end of the day it's kind of softened a little bit, so it couldn't go any higher because of that reason, but I do still think it's a nice, pretty, grungy palette. Then we have the Fantasy Cosmetica Rogue palette, which is this cute little 9-pan here. Greens, blues, purples, all my favorite things. I really, really love this blue shade. I dip into it almost every time I come into this palette, and I really like this kind of swampy green with like mint duochrome that's in here too. I think those are quite pretty. This gold seems somewhat out of place because it seems very warm compared to everything else in the palette, and this shade is just kind of lackluster for me, so I don't tend to dip into it very much, but everything else in here I really like. And of course I do really like the Fantasy Cosmetica like packaging and, you know, their whole aesthetic. Then we have Blend Bunny Surge palette, which is probably one of my favorite grungy palettes, but in my mind it's really grungy, and in person it's like somewhat grungy. So I have kind of those murky greens and blues, and you've got some more of that over here, but then you have kind of these brighter shades in here which don't necessarily fit the bill, and then you've got the neons down here. Overall, I do really like this palette though, so it definitely had to stay on the list. The only reason it's ranking a little bit lower is because of the fact that it doesn't fully meet the criteria for what I was looking for this video. Alright, then we have the Dark Souls palette. This is from Eunique Beauty, and I'm not sure that they're doing palettes like this anymore. Again, it's sort of borderline meets the criteria, but I do really love this palette, so I always like talking about it. This shade is actually quite similar to that Rogue, Fantasy Cosmetica Rogue palette shade. And then you have these mattes in here that are definitely a little bit softer, so not my favorite matte formula, but I do really like these two deep metallics that are in here as well. I think that's a very complimentary color story. And then I think in general the packaging is like pretty cute too. Then we have the Glamshop W Moro palette, which is their sort of army khaki grunge palette, and I definitely think this hits that criteria as well. They also do specialize in these really like buttery, flaky kind of shades, which I think are very, very impactful on the lid, so I really, really enjoy those. I like this shade here because it has this sort of iridescent green undertone that you just catch in certain lights, which I think is very, very nice. And then the mattes in here I think are a little same, but in general blend out really nicely. Next up is Shroud Cosmetics Moonfall, and this one again has those nice deep kind of grungy tones, and they redid the metallics for this palette, and I think they made them so like bright and poppy and interesting that it's a nice contrast between that and the deeper shades in the palette. I think the packaging is quite nice, very succinct, and if I remember correctly, these are also magnetic shades in the pans, so you can go ahead and pop those out if you want to switch them around. And then we have Butte Bean and Shroud It's Freaking Bats, one of my favorite kind of grungy palettes, and you've got kind of those swampy grungy shades. The only shade that I would say isn't super like swampy grungy would be this one, Zero, because it has that like aqua blue flip to it, and then this Apparition shade because it's kind of this like purpley base. Both of those tend to sort of pull me out of that grunge mentality, but everything else in here I think fits the bill. It's great quality. Again, I'm thinking this is a magnetic palette, so you can switch the pans out if you want to. Next up we have Colourpop Twilight, and again, I am not a Twilight person, but here we are. It definitely has that cool kind of swampy at daybreak kind of a vibe to it. I really like the sort of blue-green shades that are in here. I could do without the brown shades that are in here. These two metallics are very, very beautiful, and I even like this kind of pressed glitter hybrid shade that they have here. I think that's really pretty as well. So overall I like the quality of this one, and for all of the palettes that Colourpop did where you had these bigger pans, I think this is one of the better in terms of like how tightly pressed it is, because some of them get so tightly pressed you can hardly use the palettes themselves. So this one came up a little higher because I like it. I think it's a good palette. Alright, then we have the GiveMeGlow Mystic Garden, and this palette was expensive and it's heavy. It's like Pat McGrath heavy, but the Mystic Garden like lettering on the front here fell off as I was stacking this up in the stack to review with these other palettes, so that was kind of disappointing because I literally just got this palette at Black Friday. Like, this isn't that old. This is the color story. Again, it's kind of like a brighter, swampy kind of color story, but I do think it still fits the bill. I like these swampy greens and browns here. I mean, I could have made this eye look with this palette for that aspect of it. The pinks definitely kind of take you out of that swampy vibe, but I think everything else fits quite nicely. And overall, I do like the aesthetic of the palette. I like this like emblem that's on here. I just wish it like stayed on a little bit better because I don't like when my palettes fall apart. Right, then we have Odin's Eye Giant Wolves, and this particular palette again is kind of cool toned, swampy, grungy type shades. I like the greens, I like the blues, I even like the pop of like fuchsia purple that's in here. The multi-chrome in here is really pretty, and overall this palette has held up really nicely even though it is a few years old at this point. It's a shame they don't make this one anymore. They really should, or make something very similar to it, like a companion to this one would be great, because this is just like smoky, swampy goodness. Then I included the Simply Posh Aurora Lights palette next. It definitely is not like fully swampy, murky, anything like that, because you do have some brighter tones up here, but I think especially as you get into the deeper tones, that definitely starts to pull that swampiness. And then you have some of these shades that I think just help to sort of coalesce that vision together. Overall, I think this is a beautiful palette. I love the color story. I hate these little divots. I hate the divots. But everything else I think is wonderful about this palette, and I cannot wait for their next launch to go ahead and pick up, and I want them to restock Citrus Punch so badly so I can pick that one up too. So this one is definitely a banger. Alright, we've got 5 more palettes, and 2 of them I'm going to talk about together. So next up is the Glaminatrix Cosmetics Nocturnal palette, and I think this one has also been retired, which is a shame because it's a really pretty palette. It's got this like kind of funky, grungy, swampy vibe to it, which I really appreciate. The metallics in here, like this duochrome shade, shattered before I got it, so I just had to like sort of squish it back into the pan, which is why it looks so messy. But everything else in this came intact, which I appreciate. I like that you have these really kind of bright electric colors to sort of offset some of the swampiness in the mattes. And then I even think this shade is pretty cool too, because it's like this brown to red multi-chrome, which you can kind of see as I twist it through the light. Kind of. My lighting in my room makes it easier for me to see, but very pretty color story. I do really like it. This packaging is kind of, it feels kind of weird and cheap, but the actual shades I like. Alright, next up is the Nomad Amore y Morte palette, and I picked this one for this side only because the other side of the palette is not, it's not super, I mean, it's like Valentine's Day, right? Like it's all pink, so that's not really like grungy at all, but this side I definitely thought had that grungy vibe to it. The first version of this palette that I got had some really hard pans in it, so they did replace it for me, which I appreciated, but I do really like the quality of this particular palette and Nomad's formula in general, now that they're sort of expanding their formulas. So coming in at 3 is this palette, which is the Nomad Ghost Town USA palette, and this is like your soft, smoky grunge palette, which I think is really pretty. I love the gradients that they have in here. I like that they staggered the metallics and the matte rows. I think that's really nice, like pleasing to look at. And overall, I think it's a beautiful color story. I like the packaging. I think it's like pretty cool the way the packaging has that lenticular flip to it. So overall, it has definitely been a fan favorite of mine, which is why it needed to come up almost to the very top. And then the very top 2 palettes I will talk about in tandem, and they are the Scooby-Doo and Glamlite palettes. Now, not only do I love Scooby-Doo, because I absolutely do, but I like how dark and grungy and murky the shades are in these 2 palettes. So you can see here, you've got rows of mattes, rows of metallics in both palettes. They go lighter to like really deep and dark, which I appreciate. Again, same thing with the bottom palette here. I like these kind of swampy, murky greens and blues and purple, and even this kind of pop of kind of a blurbly blue kind of shade I think still works really nicely in this particular palette. Overall, this is an awesome color story, and I just had to rank it number 1 because it is like by far my favorite kind of swampy, murky colors. And with that said, that is everything for this video. Let me know in a comment down below what are some like swampy, murky palettes that you really like in your collection. I'm very curious to hear about it. I want to thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe before you go, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!